Hello, everyone. Welcome to our lunch webinar. I'm going to crack on as we have quite an ambitious agenda today. We're going to have 6 speakers presenting over the next 60 minutes, and we're going to finish up with a poll and discussion for those who can stay from 7 p.m. So before our team present the findings of the research that we had started back in January, I just wanted to say a few words about this project for those who have missed our lunch event in January. It's quite interesting that we have many more people in this online event that we had back in January. So in this sense, COVID is probably making this sort of things more accessible. Next slide, please, Charlie. So just before I go through the agenda, it's going to be basically us presenting the team findings, and we have like 2 speakers that Charlie's going to present you, and then another one who is our sponsor. I'm going to explain that later, and then at 7 p.m. as I was mentioning, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 and how it can strengthen the case for the climate emergency. If you can go on the next slide, please, Charlie. So just a few words about the project. This project is about the climate emergency and how we can identify tangible and concrete actions across the UK to disseminate initiatives around the climate emergency so they can be scaled up to the rest of the countries. So the reason why we picked up these themes are various. The first one is that we all have each of the teams. So the team is the people you see on the left side of this slide. So each of us have some interest in the climate change topic. And at the time when we drafted the proposal to submit to the Academy of Urbanism, we all work for the Common Trust. So it really makes sense to talk about this. The second reason is that at the time there was an enormous momentum since Bristol City Council became the first council in the UK to declare a climate emergency. Back in September last year, there were around 275 local authorities in the UK that had declared a climate emergency. So when I say local authority, I'm referring to district, county, unitary, metropolitan councils. And as per the latest data that I got, it seems there is around 89% of the UK population that live in a jurisdiction which have declared a climate emergency. I guess the last main reason was that we felt there was some bridge to be built between the urban planning and the climate change words. This may be a bit more personal because I joined the Young Urbanists in 2014, and I always thought the topic had been a bit missing. So the Young Urbanists grant we applied for was a great opportunity to shed some light on the issue. So just for some stakeholder mapping on this project, on the left side, you have on the top left side, you have the Academy of Urbanism, who has provided with both logistic and financial support, offline and then online. The second organization is Commonplace that Toby Bennett is going to introduce later, but they're our sponsor, and they're the organization that are going to help us not to deliver our findings in a PDF report, but to present them in a very cool interactive map, which I is going to show you later. And the last one, as I mentioned, is Carbon Trust, and they has provided us with some solid knowledge on which we built up our research. If you go on the next slide. So we divided our research into 3 themes. I'm going to I've led on the planning bit, and I'm going to present them. Hannah has been looking into the governance and stakeholder engagement aspects, and Charlie on finance. If you go on the next slide, please. So the next slide this slide is about the case studies. Our main case study had been those who are on the slide, and it's going to be the case study, you're going to see the different points on the maps. We had to drop Exeter for some logistic reasons, and we had to drop Bristol just because we didn't manage to get hold on anyone. I think Bristol City Council has been really busy, but we can come back to it a bit later. So if you go on the next slide. So the next slide is just like an idea of the timeline. Those who attended our event know that we launched it like beginning of February, and from then onwards we have processed the feedbacks that we had received from this first workshop, and we had contacted, I think, around 100 people, and on these people we had contacted, we managed to get interviews, either in person or phone interviews, with like 25 to 30. In March, we set up the partnership with Commonplace, and in March as well, a bit later, we had drafted an article that you can read. It has been published a couple of weeks ago in the Academy of Urbanism journal called Here and Now. I'm going to put some links later on the last slide, and you can have access to the slide deck. Then COVID hit. We were supposed to do a workshop at the beginning of April, but coronavirus happened, and now we're doing this workshop from a number of cities. I think one of us, so Charlie is in Hackney, and Hannah is close to Preston. We have Toby close to Lake District. I imagine Kristen is in Kent. I'm in Paris, and yeah, so it's quite incredible that we managed to do this online. And maybe the last milestone is about like the map that Charlie's going to show, that we aim to launch for the end of the month, and Lab Beyond Proposal is something we're going to talk to you later after our presentation. If you go on the next slide. So this is the planning section, as you can imagine. I think the first thing I'd like to say about the relationship between climate change, carbon emission in cities, is that cities tend to emit less carbon emissions per capita than the rest of the countries. It's the case in the UK, but it's the case in many places in the world. So in the UK, the cities account for 54% of the population, but represent less than 46% of the carbon emission. Why it is the case? It's mainly due to the transport system, high population density, and the lower shares of emissions in urban area from industrial and commercial activities. So as a consequence, it goes without saying that large metropolitan area with both an effective public transport system and a strong tertiary sector, such as the GLA, the Greater London has, so in the case of the UK, the Greater London has the lowest CO2 per capita emission than any region due to the factors I mentioned. So what is really interesting, and this is like illustrated by the graph on the left side, is that it's a bit tiny, but again, we took this from the Center for Cities, and we're going to add the reference, but as well as emitting less CO2 emission per capita than other area, there's a decade of data that showed that the UK cities have also led the reduction seen in national CO2 emission. So as a whole, cities have reduced their emission by 29% from 2005 to 2015, which is 2 percentage points more than the national average. It's really bad that we had to drop Exeter, because Exeter has been the top performer in the UK, seeing its emission fallen by 44% during the same time frame. At the other end of the scale is Swansea, which was the only city in the UK not to see a reduction in its emission. If you go on the next slide, Charlie. So the graph on the left side gives you an idea where we've managed to reduce our carbon emissions. The changes have mainly been driven by a large fall in from the businesses, which you can see with the line in red. As the chart shows, the industrial and commercial activities accounted for over half of the overall reduction in most cities and were particularly large in, again, Exeter and also Blackburn. And meanwhile, Slough and Swansea were the only cities not to see an increase from this activity. So I'm trying to make this as interactive as I can, and it also applies to you, Charlie, so you need to get back to the former slide. It's the only time I'm going to make you this. Thank you. So this is the graph that, sorry, the image or the smart graph you can see on the right side is something I took from the Carbon Trust when we did some climate emergency webinar last year, and I thought it was too good and exactly illustrating the point we wanted to make. So had to add in basically. What I want to demonstrate here is that cities, local authorities and planning are well placed to address the climate emergency. First of all, planners they are directly involved in shaping and controlling physical land use, so they can influence over the urban form pattern, which will most likely minimize, they can choose the urban form pattern that can minimize the environmental impacts. They can play on density, and we know that urban form is a major driver of the city's GHG emissions, and they can increase the city's adaptive capacity and resilience, and how sensitive people, places, sectors are to climate change exposure. The second reason that cities and local authorities are well placed to understand the needs and opportunities in their local area. They have important roles on transport planning. So we see that a lot right now with COVID and the actions initiative lots of councils across the world have taken to provide infrastructure for walking and cycling. The other thing they can do is to provide charging infrastructure for EV and ensuring that new housing development are designed for access to public transports. You can see in the four categories that planners have other influence on some of the sectors. So on waste, they can encourage circular waste economy. On energy efficiency, they can influence over the share of renewable energy that they can take from the overall electricity generations. And there's a number of tools such as from the mayor planning application to section 106, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in our discussion section. If you go on the next slide, please. So the challenges now is that despite the amazing progress in the UK that we've done for the last 10 years in cutting the overall CO2 emission, the UK has still a long way to go to meet its 2050 carbon reduction targets, which pose a very interesting challenge for local authorities. The one thing I want to say that there is a limited scope for local policy to influence on some of the sectoral emissions, such as industry. You can either do that through welcoming developments such as efficiency saving, or from less welcoming developments such as closing like large facilities, but it's an area where local authorities have less influence than others. Planners don't have that much tool and involvement in the environmental design process for improving the energy efficiency of our buildings. And the other thing that climate change is a very fast moving beast. So we need to think about how planning can adapt to this rhythm. On the right side, I've summarized a couple of solutions that we found throughout our research. One of them is basically to tackle some of the emissions, some sectoral area that still has some potential. As I say, the emissions reduction from the transport sector have been much more modest, and cities have a clear role. Cities leaders have a clear role here to improve this, reducing use of petrol and diesel vehicles and deploying networks of EV charging points. The other one that I like, which is really a low regret action, is to design in and design out. Is about designing and design out. So you can design buildings so they are like carbon neutral from the outset, and you can design out journeys to avoid car-oriented cities by creating mixed-use developments. There is one that is quite interesting, and I'm going to finish up on this one. is the growing trend of the law to intervene in this sphere. So I think you may have seen that the third runway of Heathrow has been ruled out because it was not legal for the government to implement it, to build it, due to its climate emergency commitment and its carbon reduction target by 2050. There's an article that was published yesterday by The Guardian, probably this morning actually, which showed that some lawyers have argued that have used the growing evidence showing the link between air pollution and the impact of COVID, and have told the government that they had a legal obligation to urgently review its air quality strategy, and they use the precautionary principle and the European Convention on Human Rights to make these arguments. There's a number of reasons that I put here, but I won't have the time to go through that, but we can discuss that later. Okay, next slide is my case study. It's going to be on the map, and I'm really aware of the time, and I want Charlie and Hannah to go through their slides. So you'll find this on our very cool interactive map. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Floriane. So what I was looking at as part of this was governance. And when we talk about governance, we talk about three main issues. The first one is organizational structures and capacity. The second is concerning decision making on a local and a regional level. And the third is how to engage people in these processes and not to divorce climate change from other forms of social issues that people are facing. So firstly, I'd like to say that most of the climate emergency declarations that we saw that happened across last year and into this year were primarily political commitments. So many of the local authorities that have declared climate emergency don't have the actual capacity to deliver on such ambitious targets. So some local authorities declared climate emergency and that they'd be net zero by 2020, by 2030, and many authorities don't have the capacity or actually the ability to deliver on these targets. So that takes us to an organizational problem. So is it actually possible for a local authority to create such ambitious plans when so many local authorities often work in silos? So there is often little integration between the policies of waste, of housing, of transport, of energy, and finance departments, legal departments. So the problems that many authorities have faced is how do they work to integrate these teams and to make climate action plans that are coherent across the board. And this is because many of the problems that local authorities face are rooted in resource constraints. So councils are often not starting from zero when it comes to climate emergency. They've been working on the environment for a long time, but often they don't have the ability to scale it up, and what they need support on is consolidating or collaborating and integrating existing plans. Next slide, please, Charlie. So the next part that I was talking about, like how to engage and plan on a local and a regional level, is that we want to think of scales of change and governance when we think of scaling up. So that's thinking how do we work across boundaries. So many of the authorities that we looked at that were very successful in delivering climate action plans, or at least coming to like good partnerships on it, were those that sat within combined authorities. So that's like the West of England and Bristol, and also the City of Manchester, because they're part of Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And this is when you get more coherent planning, when a plan is more sensitive to like the geography of the area. And then when we think beyond the geography of the area and the demography of the area, we can scale it all the way back down again and look at the local level. So like how are communities organizing themselves already for climate action, and how can local authorities see what's going on and incorporate this into the work that they're doing. So like as we've seen with coronavirus, many local authorities have had to act in like very sudden ways and change their structures, and it's very responsive to the needs of the people in given areas, and this can also be translated for climate change and climate emergency. So this is concerning more things to do with citizen assemblies, but also for those authorities that don't have the resources to deliver that, it's more about how to join up or provide resources for communities that are already organising, whether that's to do with food, green spaces, air pollution, and these issues. So if Charlie goes to the next slide. Thank you. These are some of the case studies that address these three issues. So Manchester Ignition, this is of a partnership of 12 organisations that work across the region. And this is an example of Manchester understanding its limitations and identifying all of the strengths and skills and expertise across the region and thinking how to work in a way that brings all of that together. The impact of this is that by working all together, so if you see the map below, all of these partners are based in different parts of the Greater Manchester area, but they have an office where they can all work together, and this facilitates obviously collaboration and a faster flow of information, but it also addresses one of the problems that I addressed at the beginning, which is about capacity. So it upskills all the component parts of this partnership in the process. The next one is Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Services. And this is an example of a local authority working in collaboration with its neighbouring authorities. And Cambridge has been a leader in the thought process and conceptual planning process. And they've taken a less urgent response in terms of acting immediately. And they're trying to make a much more well-informed decisions on it. So they have a longer, seemingly less ambitious date on their target, but actually they're working across the board. So they're working with Oxford, Norwich, Peterborough, and this means that they can have more coherent planning across the board. And then finally, I'd say that the Citizens Assembly is something that we can, or community engagement is something that we can discuss more in the question and answer session at the end, especially in the context of COVID. But Camden Citizens Assembly is an example of an authority that works on building trust with the people that demanded the climate emergency declaration in the first place. And they practiced best practice. They paid their participants, they provided translation for all the participants, so they made it as accessible as possible. And also these, the report that came out that went to the councillors also means that the authority has come out with commitments, concrete commitments in response to the assembly. And this is about building relationships. But something I'd just like to note quickly is that Citizens Assembly are usually only accessible for local authorities that have the resources to pay for them, because they're very costly. But other authorities have managed to look on a smaller scale and think how to encourage participation even when they're resource constrained. Thank you. Charlie, do you want to move on to finance?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Everyone can hear me all right. So yeah, before getting stuck into the findings, it's worth just spending a minute adding some context to the finance for local government in the UK. In looking at how local authorities can address climate change, finance comes up as a key barrier. We can quickly see the impact of austerity and budget cuts on local government's ability to invest in projects. So this graph on the top left by the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that between 2010-11 and 17-18, spending by UK local government fell massively on highways and transport, environment and planning services, which are crucial to progressing climate action. And when we then consider in this lower graph that according to the Centre for Cities, 2 of local authorities' top spending priorities are public transport, active travel, and climate change mitigation and air quality, we can start to see how creative financing solutions are going to be really necessary if local authorities are going to gather the level of funding required to meet their often quite ambitious targets. So first of all, what do I mean when I talk about kind of smart financing? And smart financing can seem like a buzzword, but what it really means is just more flexible, really tailored to the needs of the particular use, and that it leverages the council's money against private or community investment to kind of extend that kind of bang for buck, that cost effectiveness. So smart financing is critical to plugging gaps and making budgets stretch further. we've seen that Southwark, Birmingham and Oxford have voted through climate budgets, but if these are going to meet the kind of the net zero targets, then they're going to need to be leveraged and matched by private investment in order to meet the scales for, you know, large scale transport efficiency renewables projects. Traditional forms of UK financing do exist, like Public Works Loans Board. SEDEX Finance also offers energy efficiency loans, and these can be really attractive alongside, you know, grant pots that pop up from time to time. But what they don't do is kind of leverage the council's position in the region. They often need large projects, and they aren't well suited to the kind of small scales, looking at, you know, parish council scale even. So that's a crucial bonus for you know, different types of smart financing, is looking at it through the lens of how to engage communities in delivering the plan for the future of their region, their area. And the council can really provide a focal point. So, you know, promoting, allowing community ownership of assets through, you know, community municipal investments that we've seen in West Berkshire can result in kind of a greater community ownership of the vision and the plan itself. So a few immediate solutions that have popped up from the many conversations we've had have been, you know, starting at the basics, just using all the available tools to full effect. Nottingham's parking levy, I think, maybe still is, but certainly up until recently was the only parking levy in the country. And a large amount of the community infrastructure levy is actually returned to developers because it's not used, in particular the 15% that's reserved for community scale projects. And so, you know, as important as smart financing is going to be, and as fantastic a tool it is in the arsenal of local authorities, it's also really key that we're maximizing the existing regulations and tools out there. And the second, and that kind of really helps the smart financing to become like a value add. The second is seeing the financing as an opportunity to place the council as a focal point. So if we're looking at the kind of the broad network of actors within the community, it's how can the finance be something to kind of enable people to get involved? For example, taking the workplace parking levy in Nottingham, it collects money from businesses, which kind of raises awareness with employees in the process, and it then ring fences this budget for investment in public transport that then reduces employees' need to drive in the first place. So that's a really great example of kind of joined up thinking and using financing as like a wider policy lever. And then thirdly, just kind of talking about procurement, which, you know, was something that we looked at, and I'm not really going to talk that much about in the scope of this today, is just ties back to using available tools to full effect. If there are massive budget constraints, then look at what's already being spent, there's existing funding streams that are being spent. So highlighting two case studies, and these are going to be up on the map anyway, so in much greater detail, but two different types that are really interesting, focusing mainly on the Ignition case study. And that's a project that was looking at identifying and testing innovative ways for local authorities to finance adaptation specifically. And the one that I've pulled out here is a pilot they did on sustainable drainage solutions and how to finance that. And they tested it on a school, and it was kind of by reducing the amount of kind of concreted land on the school site, they were able to bring the charge from United Utilities, the water provider, down a band from charging band 6 to charging band 5. And as a result of that actually cut the school's water bill in half and provided the kind of energy efficiency style payback for the project. So that was the most advanced business model of the broader Ignition project, and was a great success, and has really kind of proved a new method of financing adaptation, which is really interesting. So yeah, that one's up on the map. And then the other one is Lambeth, going back to that procurement policy. They spend, you know, 588 million on procurement each year. And one of the things they introduced as a new policy was a few things specifically relating to emissions, so requiring accreditation to Silver Fleet Operator Recognition Scheme. And what that did is that started to include kind of fuel use tracking and monitoring miles per gallon and efficiency improvements. So just kind of like getting the data streams from contractors, certainly from a footprinting perspective, that's something that I know is extremely valuable. And then two other things was, getting contractors as part of their submissions for proposals to say, how much they would reduce emissions on the contract, or how many zero emission vehicles they'd be using on the contract. And so that's quite, a soft way of starting to introduce greening of procurement processes. So more broadly, just whizzing through the conclusion of our kind of findings, is that taking a step back and looking at when we first started putting together this proposal, we made a number of kind of observations about the barriers that were facing local government climate action in the UK today. Foremost among them is this kind of issue of paralysis, whether there's like a struggle to know what's fully possible under existing powers, or to be certain that a selected intervention is kind of the right one or the best one, and then to be confident enough about that to commit the large sums of capital that's required. So this project, we kind of wanted to create like a practical bridge over the knowledge gap. We wanted to talk to officers across the UK and then identify best-in-class examples of different types of interventions that can be shared and replicated. And from the beginning, we've recognized that and wanted to reflect that many authorities are leading in the UK, but in their own specific way, and that all can kind of learn from each other. So we're hoping that the interactive map can be kind of a facilitator of this knowledge sharing, and even kind of present a menu of options for local authorities to potentially try, and also to contact other local authorities and get more information from them. So maybe first off, a massive thank you to the interested individuals, organizations who are so generous with their time in talking to us. Understandably, we've been a little disrupted with COVID, but as we kind of move through the project into the closing stage now, we're going to be taking the map live and plotting all of the case studies on. Hopefully the map will go live, other people will plot their projects on, and we're also looking at who can take this further, who can take on the project, take on the map, and develop it more as a tool. That is kind of the rapid tour of the findings, and I think we can now move on to our other three speakers. We're very lucky to be joined by three others. We've got Christine Wissink from Kent County Council, Neil Jones from Possible, and Toby Bennett from Commonplace. Christine's up first. I think I'll just give a reminder that following Toby, we'll just take a quick look at the interactive map before the discussion, and yeah, just take you through that. And we're really interested to hear if you think we've asked the right questions about the case studies on the map. But yeah, Christine is the Adaptation Program Manager for Kent County Council, and we're very happy to have her speaking here. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Christine.
Hi, yeah, thank you. And it's been fascinating to hear the updates on the work that you've all been doing. And hopefully I'll be able to, in my presentation, tie up some of the things that you've discussed, you found, and those next steps that you've discussed in the previous presentation. So thank you for having me. I'm Christine Wissink. I'm the Adaptation Program Manager, as was introduced. And I'm here to give you just a bit of an update on some of the pieces of work we've done at KCC around particularly adaptation, but we'll touch on mitigation and the climate emergency as well, to give you guys some of that kind of bridging, that network, that sharing from some of this work the work and lessons that we've had. So next, please. So in Kent, we have been working on the environment for years and years and years. And what underpins all the work that the County Council does is a document called the Environment Strategy. And while that underpins what the county does, it's also a partnership document. So it uses our networks, it builds on our partnerships, both in the private sector, the public sector, non-for-profits, and also into the wider communities. And that has been kind of the foundation of all of the work that we've done in KCC, and again, with our partners around the environment for the last kind of at least 10 to 15 years. We're on kind of the third iteration of that at the moment, which is the picture on the left-hand corner, our document. And from that piece of strategy and policy, if you will, all sorts of strands of work fall under that. Particularly three main ones that look at first kind of protecting and enhancing our environment, then better using and kind of making use of what is existing in the environment already, then looking into the future and making sure that into kind of whether it's 5, 10, 15 years, 100 years from now, we have the best environment we can. And a number of different pieces of work fall under that through different partnerships. We also have a climate emergency statement as a county council, and what's very interesting about our emergency statement, which is not necessarily something that most councils have done in their declarations, is we actually include adaptation and resilience as part of the whole of the conversation that needs to be had around climate change. Yes, we need to mitigate, but equally we have an amount of climate change that is already baked in, so we really need to be addressing that change that's coming down the pipeline. Next slide. Right, so before I touch base on actually the adaptation work, I did want to just mention the mitigation, especially from the climate emergency side, because we do need to cut our emissions as fast as possible with that. We have had some successes as a county council, again, recently, but also over a while of good chunks of work. So as a county council, we've lowered our GHG emissions by 45%. We're ahead of our target as a council. And there are some really big areas where we've lost or reduced our GHGs. Particularly from our highways lighting, where we've shifted to LEDs in the majority of our lighting, and we're increasingly looking to have all our highways lights LEDs, our street lighting. We've also done various things with our corporate estate, our fleet, shifting to kind of electric vehicles within our fleet, and how we are reducing our business miles as well. So some really great work internally on KCC's point of view for lowering our emissions. We've also used Salix, it was mentioned in the previous presentation, to invest in various kind of energy savings, low carbon measures on our corporate estates. However, we've also done pieces of work and been able to find financing or be able to deliver financing for businesses and communities. And those are the last 2 points in this slide. So firstly, through our low carbon network, particularly through a project called Locase, we were able to give 18 million pounds worth of kind of support to businesses, about 1,800 across the Southeast and Kent in particular, to move towards a low carbon economy, support kind of the low carbon and environmental goods and services sector and grow that. So Kent's a really good place to do that kind of business. We've also been able to support and fund over 150 energy saving and generation projects. And these are kind of relatively small micro projects. So the parish council point mentioned earlier, we are actually able to be delivering generation on a community scale and supporting that as a county council. So we are doing that kind of regional approach, but also as much of the community approach when it comes to energy and low carbon futures. Next slide. But why adaptation? That's really my bag. Well, firstly, as I said, climate change is already happening, and we really need to understand kind of the risks and the costs and how proactive action will help reduce those. And again, the previous presentation was really interesting to hear that there's all these barriers, and one of the barriers that was mentioned was that people don't necessarily know what to do or how effective it's going to be. And that's really where kind of my work comes in at the county council level. Next slide, please. So areas that my team focuses on, they're rather unique. So we've got kind of incidences of risk, distributional impacts. So again, we've heard from a previous slide how social justice is really important when we're talking about the climate emergency and how we're reacting to it. Institutions and governance is important. And then in our case, resilience to severe weather is a good gateway to talking about more long-term adaptation capacity. Next slide. So there's a key set of activity, and I'm going to briefly just whiz you through a couple of these, because in the work that you do, the groups that you're involved in, you might find some really interesting tools or best practice within some of the work that we do in KCC. So come back to this slide at another point, but I'm going to go through each one of these individually. So next slide, please. So firstly, the CCRA and the climate projections at KCC. One thing that we've done over the last year or so is we've taken the National Climate Change Risk Assessment of 2017 and downscaled it to a regional level, looking at what makes Kent the place it is, what drives its economy, what drives its society, and how climate change is going to affect those different things that are unique to us. And we have used the UKCP 18 climate models to get a better understanding of what Kent's future is going to look like. We have identified 6 different risks in one research priority, again, aligning with the CCRA, the national CCRA, 4 of which are current present day risks that will only get worse, and 3 of which that are either not quite so big of a deal right now, but will be, or we don't necessarily know and need to do more research. We also took that kind of overall approach to Kent and drilled down into the sectors that made it kind of Kent the place it is. And so we have 6 different sector summaries that look at how climate change is going to be affecting them specifically within our region. And up in the top corner, you see the priority risks. None of those should come as a surprise to any of you involved in climate work. So higher temperatures, risk from flooding, risk from drought, for instance. And actually that reflects really well in the data we're getting from the UKCP 18 models, which is showing that the increased temperatures we're going to see, or increased or decreased precipitation, I guess, will not be balanced out with the cooler temperatures and the increased precipitation. So we will be at deficits to what we're normally used to. Next slide. We have also done an in-depth look at our health and social care sector, particularly using the Climate Just data set, which you can link to from that topmost URL, but it allows you to look at what makes people vulnerable and what is their exposure, and then where does that interlink. So it's not just looking at one thing or the other, but that combination. And it's a new way, a new indices of looking at risk and vulnerability. So we've used Climate Just to find out where our priority communities are, where that vulnerability exposure risk is the highest. And you'll see, probably not surprisingly, coastal areas, towns tend to have some of the highest vulnerability and risk. We also looked at our, we also looked very briefly at our actual assets, so where our buildings are, and mapped those in a different program called SHAPE. And that allows us to look at where our, for instance, our care homes are relative to risk. So that's all available through those links. Next slide. We have another tool that we'd like to get more people involved in called SWIMS. And what SWIMS does is it captures data sets to show how we're currently being impacted by severe weather. We have over 18 million recorded onto the system already, 200 users, and we want to increasingly get people on it. And it looks at costs, reputational data, location of what kind of severe weather and how it's being impacted. And you've got a screenshot in the lower corner that shows you the dashboard of a system in terms of how the ongoing costs are monitored within that system. Next slide. And then the last tool I just wanted to kind of highlight, throw your way, lots to kind of probably think about or go back and check afterwards, but is a tool called the Adaptation Catalyst. And what it does is it starts to solve some of the problems that we heard about in the previous slide, the previous presentation. So what do you do? When do you do it? How do you overcome some of those barriers? And the tool that we've created uses insights, uses visualizations to show you how kind of asset management, choices between different types of measures might interact, what kind of actions need to be taken now versus later, and what might kind of not work within the system in the capacity. And it shows them the effectiveness of what combinations are kind of the best given the scenarios. And what's really great about this tool is it's applicable to all sorts of climate change risks, sea level rise, rainfall, increasing temperatures. It's also applicable to different scales, so regional or site specific. You can use firm numbers, precise numbers if you have them, to do cost benefit analysis, or you can use scales. It's really user-friendly and really kind of generic, yet you can do some amazing analysis. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to give you a quick look at what it actually looks like. And again, your hyperlink to this tool is in the slide. But basically, as I said, it's this decision support tool to help you figure out what actions to take, when, and why. Why is it going to make your system do better or fail? And I've just done one screenshot of it. It's not the prettiest tool, but what it does is pretty impressive. But you see through this scenario that I've shown you on the slide, basically up until about the middle of the century, the green bar demonstrates that the select measures against this climate change effect are being successful. But all of a sudden, where the green bar goes gray, it's no longer, you can see that there's a vulnerability group of impact that is spiking, whereas when we bring in other measures, we then regain our capacity until later on through time. So it's a really interesting tool. I'd love to have you have a look at it, and I'm very much available to chat through any of these tools with you more directly. And I think the next slide has my contact details. So that's Kent, a whirlwind tour of some tools.
Thanks, Christine. We have a question. I don't know whether you want to answer it now before we go on to powering parks.
Yep, I can't have my video on, I don't think, at the same time as this, but let me just double check.
So the question is, it's great that you're using these, but are your counterparts or equivalents in other councils using the same to allow comparison on a larger scale? And are you sharing best practice or cross-boundary cooperation?
Right. Our counterparts are not currently using these, but part of the reason why I'm presenting here today is that I'd really like to see counterparts start to use them, both within the UK, but also widely. A lot of the projects that we do that have funded these pieces of work are actually EU funded projects. So we've got partners, not just in the UK, doing work similar to this, but we are hoping through kind of dissemination activities such as this, that more people take these tools on board and start using them, but they are being used within Kent.
Perfect, thank you, Christine. All right, Neil, would you like to go?
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. Yeah, my name is Neil, and I am a project manager at the climate change charity Possible. We run a number of projects and campaigns which aim to bring people together to be able to take positive practical action on climate change. And one of the projects which I work on is powering parks, and it's all about harvesting heat from parks and green spaces to be able to put to good use in nearby buildings. I'm actually going to cheat and skip the introduction to the project by showing you a very quick video. It's about 2 minutes long, I believe. Yeah, please, if you already know about heat pumps and how they work, you might want to switch off for the first 30 seconds, but it gets more interesting, I promise.
A big chunk of the carbon emissions here in the UK comes from heating homes, workplaces, schools and businesses. That's because most buildings have boilers that burn fossil fuels, normally gas, to keep them warm. For a safe climate, that gas has got to go, and we've only got a few decades to kick it. One technology ready to replace these dirty boilers is something called a heat pump. They're magic, except they're actually science. Here's how they work. The sun beams down vast amounts of heat, lots of which is absorbed by the earth. We call this ambient heat, which means it's spread out across earth, air and water. Because there's so much earth, absorbing huge amounts of heat only leads to small increases in temperature. So while we don't think of the ground beneath our feet as being hot, there is actually lots of heat energy in it. A heat pump is designed to gather this spread out heat from all around us, concentrate it and pump it into buildings to warm them. It does this in 3 stages. First, water in long pipes underground or underwater rises by a few degrees in temperature as it absorbs ambient heat. Second, the water transfers its heat to a special fluid. By controlling the pressure in different zones of the machine, the heat pump can make the fluid give up its heat at a high temperature. Third, this high temperature fluid warms the water that then runs through the radiators of the building, warming it up. These three cycles work simultaneously to turn low temperature ambient heat into high temperature indoor heat to keep us warm. To run a heat pump you need electricity, but, and here's the magic, because we're tapping into all this free heat underground, for every unit of electricity you put in, you get up to 5 units of heat out. This is where parks come in. Parks have lots of heat in them. Think of all that soil, all those ponds. That heat, with the help of heat pumps, can be used to warm buildings in or near parks, replacing gas use and lowering energy bills. If the park's authority owns those buildings, they save money on bills. If someone else owns those buildings, they pay the park for the heat. In both cases, that's more cash, just as local budgets are getting squeezed. And more cash means more sustainable parks, a source of joy, calm, fun, and well-being for everyone. There are other benefits too. By cutting down on burning gas, we'll be improving air quality. And of course, low carbon heat pumps will help us tackle climate change. We're working with Hackney Council, heat pump experts and local people to prove this idea can work. Then we want to help parks all over the country to get on board. Helping parks and tackling climate change is possible.
So that was a quick introduction to what we've been doing in Hackney. We've been working there very closely with the Parks and Leisure team at Hackney Council, and also with the people who've been doing all the clever technical work based in Edinburgh, called scene.community is their website. We found through this project in Hackney that there are lots of benefits of putting heat pumps in parks. One of those main ones is obviously that they can generate income. That is, can generate income. There are a number of things at play which can make the business case better or worse, and I'll come onto that a bit in a little bit. But they're also a great way to cut carbon emissions. And we have done a study on the potential of heat pumps to reduce carbon emissions across GB, and I'll tell you a bit more about that at the end as well. Also a great opportunity to cut to improve air quality and cut down on the NOx pollutants, which are so dangerous in our towns and cities. Another great thing is that they can add value to green spaces. So lots of our green spaces have been at risk and have been seen as a place where they could be developed for various reasons. But by being a host to valuable energy energy facilities, then they can help protect that green space from that development. And I'm sure as many of you appreciate over the past few weeks, that we really need and love our green spaces, and we do need to protect them. There was also a great place to engage communities and demonstrate what climate action can look like. So bring people on board to show what kind of solutions are available. But there are some barriers too. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we've come across that has been particularly difficult for us is the difference between electricity prices and gas prices. Gas in the UK is artificially and ridiculously cheap because of subsidies, and the particularly high electricity prices. So that differential can create problems for the business case. It's not the same everywhere, but it was a particular problem in Hackney. The deal that they have is very, very cheap gas prices, and yeah, that is does create problems for the business case. The other thing has been lots of uncertainty around the renewable heat incentive. So the RHI, which is the main incentive scheme for heat pumps across the UK, was scheduled to come to an end in March next year. There has been an extension to the domestic side of the scheme for a further 2 years. And schemes that are in a position to reach financial close by the end of March next year will be given an extra 12 months to actually get their heat pumps up and running to still qualify for the RHI. But at the end of that, it's still unclear as to what will be in place to support those large projects. What has been proposed is a new scheme for grants for heat pumps up to 45 kilowatts. So the kind of thing that would be suitable for an average home or a small business. And that would be a £4,000 grant. The issue with that is that it doesn't cover the big projects that we want to see happening, the places like leisure centres and schools. That can also be great places to engage people on the issue too. And the other thing is that there's £100 million allocated over the 2 years from 2022 to 2024. If we continued at that pace, it would take 1,500 years to reach the Committee on Climate Change's recommended target on heat pump deployment in the UK. So there is a big issue there with ambition. Go to the next slide, please. So what we've been doing in Hackney is, well, we started off with a borough-wide search for opportunities for park heat projects. And we looked at about 50 parks and green spaces across the borough. We did feasibility studies for 5 of those projects and then took 3 of those through to investment grade business cases. One of those projects is actually going through to development, and that's Abney Park, which is an old cemetery. It's one of those beautiful old London overgrown cemeteries that's going through having a redevelopment project going through over the next couple of years, which they are including a proposal for a heat pump in that. The other couple of projects, so one was put on hold due to the uncertainty around the RHI, and the other one was where the development was put on ice, really just because the financial case was very difficult to make because of those those differentials between the gas and electricity prices. And next slide, please. But what we are doing is everything that we've learned on this project and on other work that has been done, we want other councils to be able to learn from it and benefit from it. So we are launching a replication toolkit, which will be available from September. We're currently developing it. What's showing on the screen now is a very rough kind of draft map of how it will work, but it's going to be an interactive tool that will be on the Possible website that will guide you through. It's not meant to be like a report that you read from beginning to end, but you can kind of dive in and get the information that you need depending on what stage you are in your kind of knowledge about heat pumps or your journey in terms of developing a project. So we hope that will be great use to local authorities, and we are working with 5 local authorities at the moment using this toolkit to get really valuable feedback from them on how useful it is and how we can tweak it. And the final slide, please. And the other piece of work that we've been doing on this project is, as I referred to earlier, a GB-wide study. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to the figures for Northern Ireland, but we looked at the potential for harvesting park and green space heat across England, Scotland and Wales. And we found that there's potential for 30 gigawatts of heat to be harvested to keep our buildings warm, and that could save, if all those projects went ahead, which would be very unlikely, but if they did, then the potential there to save up to 8 million tonnes of carbon emissions each year. Which is a great potential for lots of councils and a great way to help them meet their climate emergency action plans. So we are in talks now with further councils to see how we can help them to get started on the park heat journeys. I think I will leave it there. But if you have any questions, my email address was on my first slide there, or if you go onto our Possible website, you can contact me through there as well. Thank you.
There's a question for Neil, and it's regarding heat pumps from Iona, and it's admittedly she's out of touch, but aren't pumps deployed in conjunction with more conventional heat sources in buildings?
Yes, yeah. So that is an option. So you can have so you can either replace the whole system so that the heat pump becomes the new source of heating, or they can be put in place alongside the existing the existing boilers or whatever's being used there. The projects that we've been looking at is actually using the heat pump 100% to heat the building, but yeah, there is scope for combined systems.
There was one more question. Are there any links between Powering Parks and the Park Power Initiative in Scotland?
Yeah, there are. So, and we have a very similar name, and that is a coincidence, but we're actually on that. So we are funded through the Rethinking Parks scheme, which is a Nesta program funded by the National Lottery, Heritage and Community Funds. And the Park Power Initiative in Scotland is also in the same cohort as us. And they're referenced in our report, and we've been working quite closely on our dissemination as well.
Nice. And this is a question from Carlos, and he'd like to know what kind of conditions are assessed in order to consider a park or a green area as a potential site where this could be implemented. Is this specified in the tool that you mentioned?
We do specify it. So in the report that we did, we were looking at parks and green spaces that were publicly accessible, but were close to a heat demand. And were not covered, so we excluded areas that were covered by trees or would make an installation difficult. We also assumed that there'd be a 50-50 split between horizontal heat slinky systems for gathering the heat, and the boreholes, which are sunk 100 to 200 meters down. So that could be, if you wanted to increase the heat yield, then you could install more vertical systems, or if you wanted to reduce the costs, you could install more horizontal systems, which are less intrusive. And in terms of what makes a good a good park or green space, then yeah, one that is open, that's quite easy, it's quite close to the heat demand, but there are lots and lots of factors, and you will be able to find those in the toolkit.
Thank
Great.
you, Neil.
Thanks
Sorry,
very much, Neil.
Sorry, can I just answer Emily's question on the links between powering parks and park power? Because I was in Edinburgh just before COVID, and I interviewed them, and it's an initiative that has been driven by Green Space Scotland, and they started to work on it like a while ago, like I think it was 2010, so 10 years ago, and they've been like doing this for 5 parks in Scotland, 4 near Edinburgh, 1 in Glasgow, and the initiative is actually going to be displayed in our map. That was
Very
it.
cool. Great. Well, on to our third and final speaker, Toby, coming to us from Commonplace, where he is the local government lead.
Hello, yes, I am Toby Bennett from Commonplace. I'll try and keep this quick as I'm slightly conscious of time. So fortunately, I just have the one slide, which you can see now. So in terms of a kind of basic description of what we do at Commonplace, Commonplace is a digital engagement tool, consultation platform, and a data-driven insight solution designed for cities and places. So by this, we mean we use digital tools to reach large numbers of people. We then consult them on things that matter to them, such as climate change. And the data we collect throughout that process is used to help inform decisions around those policies, plans, designs, whatever it is that affects that place. We're all about connecting people to places. So what we're good at doing is reaching people. This can be anything from 10 times to 100 times more people than traditional means and methods. And the 3 kind of things that we're particularly good at doing in that sense is reaching time poor people. So people who don't have the time to attend town hall meetings or workshops or assemblies. And this means that a lot of our traffic actually comes through mobile. So around about 50% of our traffic is through mobile. We're also really good at reaching those who are usually left unheard. So kind of reaching beyond the usual suspects. And some of this is through the engagement and demographic data we collect, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. And some of it is through the bespoke processes of engagement that we help to design to enable the organizations we work with to actually reach large numbers of people, but also a representative sample. Finally, we're very good at reaching a younger demographic. So 70% of our users are between the ages of 25 and 45. And this is something that we're particularly proud about. The way that we do this is through 3 different modules. 2 are kind of front-facing and 1 is a back-end data dashboard. So I'll talk through the 2 front-facing ones first. We have what we call the community heat map. So effectively, this is an interactive online mapping tool whereby people are encouraged to drop a pin on a place and tell us what they think about that place, things that are working well, things that need improving, and ideas to make that place better. A lot of that is to do with transport, high streets, improving the built environment by making it more user-friendly for people to walk and cycle. The mapping tool helps us to baseline and benchmark local sentiment about a place. So it's effectively a way of taking a sort of temperature check on how people feel about that place and analyzing need in that area. The second module we use is called design feedback. So this is a way of presenting complex plans, designs, policies appealingly and kind of engagingly online. It's an extremely flexible tool. So if you're able to edit a PowerPoint, you would be able to directly edit this module online. And we can embed a whole range of content onto that. So that's anything from obviously kind of free flow text, images, videos, overlay images, so you can see what a place looks like now, what it would look like if that project were to be delivered. And we're even working on embedding things like AR and VR. We often use these tools sequentially. So we'll use the map to analyze need around a particular area. And then the ideas that come forward from the emerging trends and themes that people talk about are used to inform the designs that subsequently get put forward. All Commonplaces also have a landing page with a title and a high-level 2-sentence description of that project. They have an about section, which contextualizes the nature of the project, the point behind the engagement, and any additional kind of quite granular or detailed descriptions of the reason behind the project. We have a news function, which enables 2 methods of communication. So one is effectively an online microblog. This is a great way of just feeding back to people things that they've said, some of those emerging trends that I mentioned before, and just updating and informing people as you move through that engagement process. It also functions as a kind of mail shot. So when people move through the user flow of Commonplace, they upload their kind of sentiment on the front face of the platform. They then fill out questions around demography, which are all tailorable. And then they land on a page whereby they're encouraged to sign up to notifications and newsletters. So once we capture those email addresses, we're then able to fire out emails to everyone who has been engaged with that process and opted in to receive notifications about it. Finally, the back-end data dashboard. This is not something that's visible to the public, but this is where the most important function of the platform actually happens. So the information that we're capturing throughout this process is surfaced in real time as you move through, and it's surfaced in kind of visual aids like charts and graphs, which you can screenshot and use for reporting. You can also download all of the data via CSV files. So that means that you can actually start to cross-analyze some of the information that's come through the platform, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. The 3 areas of data that we collect, the first is sentiment. So quite literally the questions we're asking people throughout that consultation process, just kind of what they think. We capture this in 2 ways. So the first is quantitatively. This is extremely important. We have a lot of users who come through our platform. So being able to quantify the things that they have said makes it extremely easy to analyze what will be or what is a very large data set. And we do that by utilizing tagging systems, prioritization questions, voting, things like that. And then the second is qualitative. So this just helps to provide a bit of color to the quantitative data set. So people are also have the opportunity to write out a written statement about the things that they're being consulted on. The second set of information we capture is around demography. So these questions are not mandatory, but we find that most respondents do actually fill out this information once they get to that stage of the user flow. This part of the process is really important because it's fantastic to know what people collectively think at a high level, but being able to isolate different sections of that data is extremely important. So people who cycle to work will have a different experience of a place to people who use public transport or drive to work. And this was particularly pertinent in some of the work that we did with Camden on their climate assembly. It also means that you can start to cross-analyze the things that people have said as well. The final piece of data that we collect is around engagement. So this is just quite literally how you're reaching people. Where are they coming from? A lot of our traffic comes through social media. A lot of it is quite organic sharing of people's views and thoughts on the platform. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever it might be, but also slightly more traditional means and methods. So just emailing out to people effectively. We can also track users on the platform, so we can start to understand how people are actually interacting with the content, how much of it they've read, what they've responded to, kind of what they're interested in, I suppose, to a degree. And this means that we can start to nudge people into different actions. So if someone has responded to one element of a consultation and we think they might be interested in another element, we can send out a mail shot to them and or reply through the platform, just to signpost the fact that they may be interested in contributing to another area. So sort of in a nutshell, that's how the technology works. There is a whole other side to our organization as well, which I won't go into too much detail on, but we are effectively a collection of sociologists, digital anthropologists, communications experts, planners, entrepreneurs, and we bring all of those skills together to make sure that the projects that we work on are genuinely reaching the type of people that they need to reach, and are eliciting the responses that are going to be valuable to the organizations we work with. Just to talk through very briefly two examples of our work around climate change and COVID. So we were part of Camden's climate assembly. We provided a sort of digital wraparound to the offline work that they did. So they had a sequence of assemblies, part of which was around, obviously this has been mentioned earlier on, but part of which was around knowledge building for the members of the assembly. As mentioned earlier, they approached that as a kind of sortition methodology, whereby it was a representative sample of people who had very different views, and got them together in a room just to discuss them. So what we did was we kind of wrapped around our technology around those assemblies so that we could incorporate a lot more views and a lot more people into that process. And because of the demographic data that we are able to collect, we could also appropriate that kind of sortition methodology by aggregating views from people who perhaps have slightly different opinions on climate change. We did this by using our design feedback module. So just by presenting different areas that people can comment on, and we split that into 4 different sections. So the types of things that people can do at home. So, perhaps move towards more renewable energy, perhaps move from driving to work to cycling to work, whatever it might be, just small actions that individuals can take. What can be done in neighborhoods as well by businesses and local organizations, how they can move some of their processes to a more carbon friendly or carbon neutral way of working, and what the council can do as well at a policy level. So this is things like electric only vehicles, and some of it can be to do with social value add commitments as well from suppliers. And then finally, at a slightly more sort of conceptual level, what can central government do to tackle this issue, and what role the council can play in lobbying government to actually take action on it. So that was kind of the work that we did with Camden. More recently, we've been working a lot on COVID-19 response. As a socially purposeful business, we've been issuing free licenses to local authorities and community organizations as a way of enabling them to better tackle the issue around the virus. A lot of this, particularly as we are about place, a lot of this has been to do with social distancing. So we've been using our community heat map to identify areas where perhaps bollards could be removed, pavements could be slightly larger, just a way of enabling people to move around spaces in a safe way. One of the interesting questions that we've been asking as a result of this process is whether or not people actually want to keep these changes going forwards permanently after the pandemic. And this is interesting given the Emergency Powers Act, which means that local authorities have special powers to enact those changes that can stay there permanently. And this will have potentially a big impact on the challenge around the climate. The other interesting element to this is people's changing behavior. So we don't know what this means and what behaviors will be embedded in society and communities going forwards, but Commonplace provides an opportunity to make positive changes off the back of those behavioral changes during a time where people are more accepting of change because of the need for it. And then the final element to some of this work is that we host our platforms in posterity for the organizations we work with, which is a promise, again, connected to our social ethos as a business. And this means that in a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it might be, we can look back at the data and say, this is how you felt then. Has your behavior changed? If so, why? And at Commonplace, we're in a unique position to measure that change in behavior going forwards as a sort of longitudinal study. This is also data that we can understand across a range of different local authorities we work with. So we work with the majority of London's boroughs, the GLA, transport authorities across the UK, combined authorities. And what we're able to do is, as we're assembling this data, this enables us to share best practice and help to build knowledge across the public sector as to how they can tackle COVID-19, but also some of the positive impacts that have happened on the climate as a result of some of these projects, people's changing behaviors, and just some of the action that is taken as a result of that. And I can share some of these examples after the session today. So in a nutshell, that's me and Commonplace.
Great, thank you so much, Toby. Really interesting. And thank you to yourself and Commonplace for getting us set up on the map. We're just gonna click through and just take a quick look at it. Hopefully everyone can still see that. This is what the current state of the interactive map, the main project output is. It's going to be fully populated with projects, and you can see what an existing project looks like. This is the workplace parking levy in Nottingham, and it's capturing information on the project. And if I go up here, then we can actually put in our own project, and this just give you a quick walkthrough of what we're capturing. And maybe if people look at these questions and they say, oh, why aren't you asking this question? Maybe you should rephrase that into this question. Then please do let us know, because we really want to hear from you if we're asking the right questions about these projects, making sure the right learnings and information is going to be shared. We've got the project name, we've got the key project partners or sponsors, what project type it best fits that's aligned with the 3 areas we looked at as part of the project. We've then got what stage of development is the project at, which goes from conceptual stage to operational stage. And then we've got the main kind of meatiest box, which is what are the most successful features of the project in addressing the climate emergency. So, that's the key project mechanism really. And how is it different? How is it adding value? How is it making a difference? And then the cost brackets of the project, which are rough estimates. Exact details can be put in here. And then this one, which we think is really interesting, which is what other local authorities or other organizations should be aware of this initiative. Who else might find this interesting, might find this useful? Who else might be able to replicate this? And that's really fantastic. And then finally, where can I find out more about it? So if someone's browsing and looking at these projects, looking at these pins, they can look at something and say, oh, well, we could do that. That looks really interesting. And then, click through the link and find out more information and maybe talk to the people who ran that project to begin with. So that's the map in its current state. And we look forward to plotting all of the case studies on it and then taking it live and hopefully seeing people use it in practice and see some interesting things on it. So clicking through, I think it's time that we are going to ask you guys a few questions for whoever's still on the line. I think we're gonna potentially not do the discussion. And we're just gonna do the poll and ask some questions, see the responses, and then I think that we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay, I will launch the poll now.
Fantastic, thanks Olga.
Yes, Andrew, we can circulate the link to the map, and we can also send our respective email address. So if ever you have any feedbacks to improve the questions or category we ask for each case studies, you can send that out to us. No worries. We'll still have probably like 5 minutes either to get your feedbacks on the map or to take some questions after you answer the poll. So feel free to raise hands or to drop the question on the box.
Okay, we have 19 people of 27 voted, so let's wait a little bit. Okay, 80% voted. Should we wait or should we end the poll to get the results?
Does it include us as hosts and organizers?
I don't think so. I was not able to vote.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm sorry, yeah. But it counts only the participants, so.
okay.
Oh, look, 84% now.
Yeah.
I think it's fine though.
Just to answer Juan, thanks a lot. It looks great, but we'd like to have even more case studies, and the idea is that you guys will help us to populate with projects and initiatives. Earth Friends of Earth and Ashton has done something similar. They put all the case studies they had. I think it's like 31 or 33 case studies of different action that local authorities have taken in the UK. They put it on the Excel spreadsheet. Our work is quite similar, but wanted to have a map-based output. Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
I will end the polling now, okay?
Yeah.
And here are the results.
Good. I'm just going to comment as I see the results. So on the first question, I think it's quite interesting. I've done an internal presentation in my company at the Carbon Trust last week asking pretty much the same question. And the result for the first answer was 92% of like split up. So I think we're quite optimistic bunch of like climate change. Not climate change activists, but yeah, I think we're a bit more optimistic. What impact do you think there will be on people's view on climate change, more concerns? This is quite high. And yeah, I think the last answer on the COVID stimulus is showing that we're not sure what's going to happen, that the EU has just adopted a 750 billion COVID recovery, economic recovery package. And I think 25% of the measures that are in this package would be climate-friendly measures around EV, energy efficiency, retrofitting, and encouraging soft transport modes. So yeah, that's really interesting. Do you know, Olga, if we can like keep the results, or if they're going to disappear, then I need to take a cheeky screenshots?
Yes, we can extract the results from the Zoom afterwards. So
I think something worth asking for the people that thought it would slow down the impact is to think about why. And I think that's something that we could, I don't know, work more towards, because I think it's very like ideal to speed up and very optimistic to think that it will speed up climate action plans, but it'll be interesting to hear people's reasons for thinking why it would slow it down.
Yeah. Cool.
There's a question here: is tactical urbanism a good measurement system for emergency planning in terms of COVID-19? And how is it possible to make tactical urbanism more sustainable in practice?
I can take this question if you want, guys. I think I'm going to answer two things. The first one is that most of the things you see happening right now in the post-COVID world, like all the pavement widening, the sort of like temporary cycling lane, or like the definition of tactical urbanism. And the reason for this is one, that we need to act really quickly. So the COVID sort of like lockdown situation pushed us to act and to respond with tactical urbanism. And the second thing is that, as you know, lots of this public realm improvement are generally funded in the UK, and in London in particular are funded with the Transport Authority funding, TfL, and at the moment TfL is not in a very, TfL finance is not in a very good state. So the local authorities need to use the limited funding sources they have. So I think they have funded this with their cash reserves. They've also tried to get some monies from DFT. How is it possible to make tactical urbanism more sustainable in practice? I mean, these measures have been enabled because the local councils are using specific type of powers which are given to them due to the National Emergency Act that was voted, like I think in April 2020. So I don't know, like my answer would be, if they're like more accepted and more widely spread, they may be a sort of like acceptance by the public and by like the businesses to do that more often.
I think also in terms of the, oh no, sorry, first we'll answer Juan's question. It depends on the synergies to deal with climate change and those to deal with COVID-19 investment. For active travel, for example, are great for both, but investment in airports will make climate emergency worse. I think that's something like worth considering, because like when we're looking at tactical urbanism in the context of London, or where there is existing cycle infrastructure or existing pedestrian infrastructure, it's easier to make those streets wider. It's easier to like take up more of the car space. Whereas where I'm from, Preston, there's like very little infrastructure for that to begin with. So in fact, you go more towards like encouraging people to drive because there isn't the infrastructure for people to cycle, or people are not used to cycling anyway. So I think in this context, there are certain areas that are like not as urbanized or don't have the infrastructure will actually see it slow down and go, like people are disincentivized to use active travel. There's a question from Mark Tomlinson.
Do you want to read it loud, Hannah?
Yeah. So he said, don't know if it will slow down, but local politicians or discussion on Nextdoor social network is already talking about removing the temporary cycle lanes. It's a flow of traffic sort of argument, and it's very easy for them to go back to normal and relaunch by supporting the old fossil fuel economy.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting to see what's happening in continental Europe. Many of the cities that have been heavily impacted by COVID are you know, spreading like cycling networks. So Paris has, I think, has built like 50K of cycling lanes. They have built like 25K, and another 50K is going to come, but they're all like temporary cycling lane. The same would apply to Barcelona or Madrid, but there is one example that we may have our answer is Milan. Milan is going to spread across the summers 22 miles of cycling lane, and it's going to be permanent cycling lane. And that's why in the sort of landscape of European cities and what do they do post-COVID, it's probably like the most ambitious example we have. It's quite interesting. So yeah, I think Milan is sort of like quite a unique example because it's one of the cities that was mostly hit by COVID. It's probably why the answer is also the most ambitious, but it'd be quite interesting to see like which argument they've used to not to accept to go back to normal. Just on the Paris case studies, I'm in Paris now, so I'm following this quite closely. Before COVID, they were talking about a massive regional cycling network. It's quite funny. They call it RER Vélo, and RER is basically your regional train, but they're planning this at the scale of Paris region, so not Paris. It's going to be 650K of cycling lane. And what's quite interesting, and like going from Paris to suburbs and then from the suburbs to suburbs, so it's both like a radial and a concentric cycling network. What's really interesting is that the original plan was not that consensual because the Paris mayor Anne Hidalgo is from the Socialist Party, and her opponent, Valérie Pécresse, is from the right-wing party, the former, the Republican, the former UMP, and COVID has managed to sort of like ease the relationship and has managed to accelerate this plan that is now going to be implemented. So an interesting one in terms of like how COVID can sort of like has impacted like governance and politics.
Interesting. I think if there's any more questions, then potentially we have like one time for one more question and then wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Emily has mentioned a very valid point that a line of cones doesn't go far enough.
Yeah.
So we should look to green the active travel infrastructure too.
Yeah. So on this, I think there's an interesting scheme between Amsterdam's and Manchester. Amsterdam has sort of like acted as a mentor to Manchester City, to the Greater Manchester, which have like a very ambitious cycling commissioner, it's Chris Ballman, and they have like give them sort of like key tips on how to build like good cycling lane and not like just, you know, what you're saying basically, Emily, like putting some cones around and pretend this is our cycling lanes. I think that in this sort of like on this matter, London hasn't been that great in terms of like coordinating the color for a cycling lane and not separating the surface road with the cycling lane. So yeah, Manchester is the example you want to use. I'm just going to put our email addresses in the chat box so you can have them all, and we're going to refine the map, but if you can send us any improvements that you have in mind to make it better. We'll be planning to launch it toward the end of the month, so I have 2 weeks ahead of you to do that, and I'm going to be in quarantine from 2 weeks onwards, so I'll be very happy to take any feedbacks and to keep myself busy with this. So thanks a lot to all of you, and thanks a lot for this very active conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you had enjoyed it as well. We're going to circulate 3 things on top of our email address: the slide deck, the recording, and the article that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion. And thanks a lot to our speaker, Christine, Anil, and Toby, and thanks to Olga for making this happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Really, really great session.
Great. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.